Hi everyone. I want to talk about decks today. Decks are a pretty standard feature of most residential homes, and they can be very nice. Unfortunately, it's one of those projects that homeowners like to take on, and so there's some pretty terrible looking decks out there. But hopefully, today we can talk about proper ways to build your deck, maintain your deck, and materials to keep an eye out for when selecting what materials to use for your deck. So, decks can serve as an outdoor living space. Um, there's a lot of codes that apply to decks, though. I want to talk about those today. Decks can be dangerous. Mostly they're built out of wood, and if not maintained properly, or if proper materials haven't been utilized, or if they haven't been maintained well, they can become dangerous pretty quickly. They can rot. We need to use materials that will be weather resistant, and then all of our fasteners need to be corrosion resistant. So, at the very least, hot dip galvanized fasteners. And if you want to upgrade, you can go up to like stainless steel fastener, something like that. But generally, the framing of the deck is going to be pressure treated lumber, and then you're going to want to remember to seal up all of those cuts very well. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but the frame generally pressure treated, and then the actual decking itself is going to be some sort of weather resistant wood or maybe some sort of composite. And usually 2x6 is the most common material used. The actual construction of the deck is going to be pretty similar to the floor frame. So, same basic concepts. We're going to have some sort of pier pad, post holding up a girder, and then floor joists sitting on top of the girders, and then decking attached to those floor joists. And so we will talk about some ways to kind of extend the life of your deck, but just remember though that none of these things are going to last forever. Okay. So, like I said, it's very similar to a floor system, a floor construction. We're going to start by laying out where we want our deck to be, and we're going to dig some 16 by 16 by 12 holes for our pier blocks, roughly. Okay, I would say this depends a lot on your area and what kind of soil you have. We can get away with digging something 12 inches deep here because we don't have severe winters. If you were in an area that had severe winters, you would need to dig below the frost line, just like when you were digging your foundation for your house. Dig below the frost line, otherwise the ground will freeze and it will cause heave, and it'll actually lift your footings out of the ground. We can use pier blocks, is most commonly used to support the posts. Some people are going to want to use sonotubes, the circular concrete forms, and then put a bracket in those. You could put some sort of Simpson bracket directly in the concrete, directly on the ground. I would say if you're using a sonotube, this would be a great application for a really tall deck. Okay, instead of having like hinge points with a pier block and a really tall post, and then your decking sitting on top of that, if you just had that sonotube, that circular column all the way up, and then, directly attaching to the girder, that would be a really strong system, okay? And then the problem with the brackets, these can work, but you tend to end up with a situation where the post ends up really close to the ground if it's just set in one of those brackets. So the nice thing about these pier blocks is it's going to give you 8 inches or so off the ground to the bottom of that post, and that's just going to help prevent against like fungus and insect attack. Here's a picture of a sonotube, what I was talking about. You can buy these, and I don't know how long of a length they come, but I'm assuming you can get them up to 20 feet, cut them down, the taller they are, sometimes you do need to support them intermediately. And the way we've done this is we've staked 2x4s going in one direction and then screw 2x4s across those 2x4s going in the other direction just to help keep that sonotube straight. And this is that bracket I was talking about. This is a Simpson, I can't remember what this is, PBS post bracket, something or other. This part gets embedded in the concrete, and then the post sits on top of this little stand, and then you nail through all these little pre-drilled holes into the post. These have a lot of uses, foundation work, fences, stuff like that. So as far as laying out the posts, laying out the pier blocks and then the posts underneath our girders, the general rule of thumb for all of this stuff is for every 1 foot of span, let me back up a little bit. For every 1 inch of thickness on our girder, we can span 1 foot. Okay, so if we have a 4x6 girder that's 6 inches tall, generally speaking, we can span 6 feet with these pier blocks. Okay, a 4x6 girder needs support every 6 feet. If we used 4x4 girders, they would need support every 4 feet. So what size girder do you use? I don't know. You know, depending on how much room you have, a 4x10 girder is going to be more expensive than a 4x6 girder, but maybe it's worthwhile when you figure that you're saving on labor by not digging as many pier blocks, something like that. Whatever size girder you're using, that's how far apart these posts are going to be spaced. Generally, same thing with a floor frame. If you have a splice on your girders, if you're building a really long deck and you've come to 20 feet, you're going to want to use a 4x6 for those splices. Okay, 4x4 posts for the most part, depending on whatever your girder span is. Okay, we'll talk about joists here. I usually go every 24 inches with the joists when building a deck. That's plenty usually, okay? And those joists, if you're using 2x6 joists, they can span 8 feet. And so what that translates to is every 8 feet, you're gonna have a girder, okay? You could go every 16 inches, but I think that's really overkill unless you're using some thinner decking material. If you're using 2x6 decking, it'll span 24 inches or more all day long and not have any problems, okay? We're going to want to protect these. We'll talk about that later, but generally, these are just going to either get screwed in with some sort of corrosion resistant fastener, or we're going to nail these in with 16 galvanized nails. And that's usually what I do. The screws are really expensive. They are really nice. And it is nice, like if you make a mistake, you can kind of undo something, but screws are quite a bit slower and quite a bit more expensive. So attaching the deck to the house, we don't really want to attach the deck to the house, okay? If we have to, and the reason we would have to is if we have a really tall deck that has a lot of lateral thrust, we're going to want to attach that to the house, okay? But generally, just like with the fence, we want to leave a space there, okay? I have seen so many rotten houses because somebody decided it was a good idea and it was easy this way to just nail a ledger to the house, okay? And so this is really easy, okay? We've got a house. We want to attach a deck to it. Measure down to the top of the decking material. Measure down the thickness of your deck, and then nail a ledger directly to the house there, and then you can build your deck on that. You don't have to put any pier blocks down here. It really stiffens this deck up. It's great. Okay. Problem is, dirt and water and junk are going to get trapped right here, and there's not going to be any ventilation space. There's not going to be any capillary break here. Okay. This is going to rot, and then when you've nailed directly into the house, you've created a perfect entry point for insects and fungus and stuff to get into the floor framing. Another really awful thing I've done before, or not done, excuse me, I've seen before, is where people wanted to have a deck out here and they just cantilevered the floor joists out past the exterior of the house. Okay, just ran these out long and then built a deck on top of that. Okay, how in the world anybody would ever flash that, I don't know, ever seal that up. And it always was a nightmare. Okay, this deck rotted. And then the one really bad case I saw of this, they didn't even use like pressure treated lumber or anything. It was just regular fir joists, Doug fir floor joists that they were using inside the house. They cantilevered those outside, and so they were outside, exposed to the weather, and they rotted into the house, and we had to tear up a bunch of flooring inside the house to get at these rotten joists and repair it. Okay, it was kind of a nightmare. So if you can, just don't attach it to the house. It's so much easier and so much better in the long term to just throw another girder in right here and support the end of these floor joists. Okay, I use that word cantilever. We can cantilever 25% of that joist. Okay, so you can put a girder back quite a ways from the end of those deck joists, and just let them hang out past that girder. Okay, put a girder in back here. These deck joists extend past. Leave a little space there. Okay, if you still really, really need to attach that deck to the house, what you're going to want to do is you're going to use some sort of spacers. Okay, there's a lot of details for attaching decks to houses. The easiest thing to do is get some PEX tubing or some copper or some PVC pipe or something like that, and cut little 1-inch pieces and sandwich those between the deck ledger and the exterior of the house. Okay, and you're going to get some long lag bolts, and you're going to drive those lag bolts through the ledger, through the spacers, and into the rim joist of the house. And usually what I do is I kind of drive it in, start a little hole, okay, back it all the way out, and then fill a bunch of caulking where that hole is, and then drive the lag back in. Okay, so it's driving some sealant in with it. Okay, and anyway, what you're going to end up doing here is you're going to create a 1-inch space between that ledger and that rim board, and that's going to attach the deck to the house, make it more rigid, but it's going to create a space for debris to fall through, a capillary break so water falls through, and there's going to be a vented space behind that so it's able to dry. Okay, and that's the only way you should ever attach a deck to a house. So our deck boards are either going to be nailed or screwed. I would highly recommend against nailing them. Okay, I said go ahead and nail all the frame together. That's great. Okay. Once you start nailing into these deck boards, there's a really good chance that you're going to damage one of these deck boards with your hammer, and it's not going to look very good. We also want kind of a uniform appearance with the fasteners. Okay, we want everything to be in a nice straight line. We want them to be dimensioned the same, you know, come in an inch from each edge, perfectly in line with the floor joist. Another thing about screws versus nails is wood is going to shrink, and if it's nailed down, the deck board is going to kind of bounce on those nails. Just like when we talked about floor framing, and we talked about the importance of gluing our plywood subfloor down, and when materials shrink and we hear those squeaky old floors, that's because the materials have shrunk away from each other, and they're kind of like sliding on that nail, and that's creating that squeaky sound. Okay, so screws are going to hold those materials a lot better, and you're not going to end up with squeaky materials. Okay, you can get concealed fasteners, which are kind of neat. It's this bracket that one face of the bracket screws into the joist, and then the other side it screws from underneath into the deck boards. So it's kind of cool. You could have no visible fasteners on this deck, and that would be kind of neat. We want to, as we're working, maintain an 1/8 of an inch space between these deck boards. Excuse me. Over the course of the year, they're going to take on water and expand and contract. And if we install them tight, especially, it also kind of depends on how wet the wood is when you get it. But if this stuff's bone dry when you get it and you install it tight, as soon as it rains or it gets wet, it's going to expand and it's going to start bowing out and cupping and doing really weird stuff. So we want to leave some space for this wood to kind of move around a little bit. I think the best way to install a deck is to just run everything long, okay, at the edge here where it terminates. Just run everything wild, come back, clamp a board or some kind of straight edge to these, and then just cut them all at once, okay? Every time I've ever tried to cut everything perfectly and put it in place and line up these ends as I go, it always ends up wandering, okay? And you don't end up with a straight line. One really nice detail is after everything's all cut to length, get whatever material you're using, whatever decking material you're using, flip that around and cap the ends. And you get this nice like capped perimeter. It's all picture framed in it. It looks very sharp, okay? And just as a side note here, this is pressure treated lumber. This is southern yellow pine pressure treated. And it looks like a normal board. It just looks like has a kind of a greenish tint to it. Whereas our pressure treated around here would have all those staple puncture marks, okay?